The photograph was taken on a spring morning in 1920 in the small town of Harrowfield, a place that would otherwise have been forgotten by time if not for a single image. The school had prepared for the occasion with great care, its crumbling brick facade scrubbed and polished, banners hung from the windows, and the entire graduating class gathered in their heavy black gowns. The photographer, a man named Jonathan Blake, had positioned his large wooden camera on a tripod across the courtyard. The polished brass lens pointed directly at the assembled students. He had done this dozens of times before, for weddings, for family portraits, for shopkeepers who wanted to send pictures to distant relatives. Nothing about the assignment seemed unusual, and yet, when the shutter clicked and the image was pressed into permanence, something else had found its way into the frame. The students themselves looked much as one would expect of that era, solemn, stiff-backed and self-conscious under the weight of the occasion. There were 12 in total, 8 young men and 4 young women, their faces caught somewhere between childhood and adulthood. Most managed only the faintest suggestion of a smile, their expressions hovering in that peculiar mix of pride and discomfort common to posed photographs of the time. Behind them, the school loomed, its ivy-clad walls and tall arched windows lending an air of dignity to the moment. The principal, a stern man with a thick mustache, stood at the edge of the group, arms folded as though to lend the gathering an official weight. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about the photograph. Years later, when the picture was rediscovered in an old archive, its faded sepia tones and worn edges suggested nothing but history preserved on paper. Yet even a casual observer could not help but feel something unsettling the longer they looked. For in the far right-hand corner of the image, just beyond the edge of the assembled students, a figure lingered in shadow. It was not immediately obvious. The damage to the photograph, the scratches, and the faded exposure made it easy to dismiss at first. But the more one stared, the clearer it became. A tall form, elongated and indistinct, standing partly behind the corner of the school building. Unlike the others, it was blurred, almost as if it had moved during the exposure. Yet its eyes, small points of light, were fixed squarely toward the camera. It wore no cap, no gown, no attire one might expect of a student. Its clothing was darker, indistinguishable, blending into the shadow until only the outline of its face and its unblinking stare remained. When Jonathan Blake developed the photograph, he noticed it at once. His darkroom was lit only by the faint glow of the red lamp, and as the image swam into focus, he paused, the chemical tray trembling in his hands. He had taken dozens of photographs that day, each as routine as the next, but this one was different. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass, and tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, a flaw in the exposure. Yet the eyes were undeniable. They were too deliberate, too fixed, too alive. Blake set the print aside, unsettled, and finished the rest of his work. When he delivered the photographs to the school, no one seemed to notice. The students and their families were too busy pointing themselves out in the group, laughing awkwardly at their stiff poses, marveling at the novelty of being captured in such permanence. No one remarked on the corner. No one saw the figure. Or if they did, they said nothing. Years passed. The photograph was filed away, forgotten in a drawer in the school office, then later moved to the town's modest archive. It was only in the late 1950s, when the building was renovated and old records were sorted, that the picture resurfaced. A local historian named Robert Miller was the first to study it. He was cataloging the town's educational records when he uncovered the envelope, yellowed with age, and carefully removed the print. He admired the crispness of the old photography, the way the students stood in such rigid formality, and then his eyes drifted, inevitably, toward the far corner. He frowned, leaned closer, adjusted his glasses. At first, he thought it was damage, perhaps water staining or an accidental smudge. But as the light shifted across the image, he saw the outline clearly. A man, or at least the shape of one, standing apart, watching. The eyes were faint, almost a trick of shadow and grain, yet the longer he looked, the more certain he became that they were staring directly back. Miller did not speak of it at first. He was a rational man, a scholar, and he had no desire to be mocked for superstition. Yet the photograph lingered in his thoughts, troubling him long after he had set it aside. He found himself glancing back at it during his work, returning to the figure again and again. And with each look, he became more convinced that it was no accident. The figure was not a flaw, not a smudge, not a chemical error. It was deliberate. He began to investigate quietly. The class of 1920 was not hard to trace. Most had remained in Harrowfield their entire lives. Some had gone on to become farmers, shopkeepers, teachers. A few had left for the city, but their records were intact. Miller tracked down names, compared them to the faces in the photograph, and confirmed that there were 12 students and 1 principal, 13 people in total. And yet the picture contained 14. When Miller showed the photograph to others, reactions varied. Some shrugged, dismissing it as a trick of the old film. Others squinted and shifted uncomfortably, saying they could not quite put their finger on what was wrong, but that something about the image unsettled them. One woman, the niece of a student in the picture, grew pale when she saw it. She pointed toward the corner and whispered, "We don't talk about him." But when pressed, she refused to explain further, gathering her coat and leaving in haste. The photograph grew heavier in Miller's hands with each passing week. He kept it in a folder on his desk, telling himself it was only part of the archive, no different from the other relics of the town's past. But when the office grew quiet at night, and he found himself working alone, he sometimes caught the sensation of being watched. The hair on the back of his neck would prickle, and he would glance toward the folder, certain that if he opened it, the eyes would be waiting. Others began to notice too. Assistants who worked with him complained of feeling uneasy in the archive, claiming the air grew thick near Miller's desk. One young man swore he had seen a reflection in the glass of the framed maps, a tall figure, blurred and indistinct, standing in the corner of the room. He laughed nervously when he spoke of it, insisting it must have been a trick of the light. But after that, he refused to work late. Miller's notes became increasingly obsessive. He documented the names of every student, the order in which they stood, their family histories. He wrote long passages about the figure, sketching its outline, circling its eyes, comparing it to known faculty and staff. No match could be found. It was no one from the town, at least not anyone who had left a trace. And yet there it was, preserved in silver nitrate and paper, watching silently from the edge. By the winter of 1959, Miller's colleagues had grown concerned. He spoke less of ordinary matters. His conversations dominated instead by the photograph. He muttered about presence, about patience, about something that lingered where it did not belong. He told one colleague in a hushed voice that the figure was not confined to the photograph. It was only visible there, yes, but it existed beyond it, a shadow crossing into their world. The colleague laughed it off at the time, but the look in Miller's eyes, tired, hollow, and unwavering, was not so easily forgotten. The photograph itself changed, or at least seemed to. Those who looked at it in later years swore the figure grew clearer, its outline more distinct, its face less smudged than before. Some insisted its smile had widened, a faint curl at the corner of its mouth that had not been there when Miller first found it. Others said the eyes followed them, shifting subtly no matter where they stood. By the spring of 1960, the photograph had earned a quiet reputation. Archivists refused to handle it. Visitors were warned away. Yet Miller continued his study, as though compelled by something he could not resist. The last entry in his journal, written in a shaky hand, read simply, "He waits in the corner. He has always been there. He will always be there." Robert Miller's disappearance in the summer of 1960 was the first event that turned the photograph from a local curiosity into something closer to legend. His colleagues recalled that he had left the archive late one evening, muttering under his breath as he tucked the folder under his arm. He told no one where he was going, only that he needed to see it where it began. The next morning, his car was found abandoned on the outskirts of Harrowfield, parked beside the crumbling remains of the old schoolhouse. Inside the vehicle, on the passenger seat, lay the photograph. The folder was open, the print exposed, And the corner, where the figure always lingered, seemed darker, deeper, as though the shadow within had thickened during the night. Miller himself was never found. Search parties combed the fields and woods surrounding the school. Bloodhounds were brought in, and men with lanterns walked the perimeter of the grounds, but no sign of him appeared. The police concluded he must have wandered into the forest and become lost. Though privately several officers admitted there was no trail, no footprints, nothing to suggest where he had gone. It was as though he had stepped into the very corner of the photograph itself and simply ceased to exist. Rumors began almost immediately. Some said Miller had gone mad, consumed by his obsession. Others whispered that the figure had called to him, that he had seen it outside of the photograph at last. An elderly woman who had been a student at the school in the 1920s claimed she woke that very night to find a tall shape standing at the foot of her bed. She shut her eyes in terror, and when she opened them again, the figure was gone. But she swore it had the same pale, unblinking eyes as those in the photograph. The school, long since abandoned, took on a darker reputation. Children dared one another to enter the ruins, though few ever stayed past sunset. They told stories of hearing footsteps in the halls, of catching sight of movement in the corners of their vision. Some swore that if you stood in the courtyard, the very spot where the photograph was taken, you would feel someone standing just out of sight, watching from behind. The photograph itself passed into the possession of the town's historical society, locked away in a drawer that no one opened willingly. A few brave or foolish visitors asked to see it, drawn by curiosity and the thrill of the forbidden. Almost all regretted it. One man claimed that when he looked at the picture, he recognized the figure in the corner, not as a stranger, but as his own father, who had died years before the photo was ever taken. Another swore the figure's eyes had shifted during his viewing, following him around the room with malicious intent. The stories grew, spreading beyond Harrowfield into neighboring towns, then into newspapers hungry for tales of the uncanny. The 13th graduate, some called it, others referred to it simply as the watcher in the corner. By the 1970s, the photograph had become a piece of local folklore, the kind of tale teenagers repeated at parties to frighten one another. Yet beneath the exaggerations and laughter, there lingered a real unease. For those who had seen the original, print rarely laughed about it afterward. In 1983, a graduate student named Laura Henderson arrived in Harrowfield, drawn by the legend. She was writing a thesis on American ghost stories and had heard whispers of the photograph during her research. Unlike many, she approached the subject with skepticism, determined to debunk the myths. She contacted the Historical Society, requested access, and after some hesitation, was granted a supervised viewing. The archivist who accompanied her was a nervous man in his 60s. His hands shook as he unlocked the drawer and removed the folder, warning her in a low voice not to stare too long. Laura smiled politely, dismissing his superstition, and laid the print on the table. Her first impression was disappointment. The photograph was exactly what she expected. A faded image of solemn students, the kind she had seen 100 times in other archives. The figure in the corner, at first glance, seemed underwhelming. Nothing more than a smudge, a trick of shadow. She noted it in her notebook, describing its vague outline, its indistinct clothing. She was already rehearsing in her mind the passage she would write, dismissing the legend as little more than small-town hysteria. But then she leaned closer. The eyes caught her. They were faint, barely visible, yet unmistakably fixed on hers. She blinked, looked away, then back again. The students, of course, stared stiffly forward as they always had, but the figure in the corner seemed to have shifted, its head tilted slightly more toward her than before. She rubbed her eyes, telling herself it was her imagination, an afterimage, from staring too intently. And yet the sensation lingered, prickling at the base of her skull, the certainty that she was being watched. That night, she dreamed of the courtyard. The school was whole again, its bricks uncracked, the ivy thick and green. The 12 graduates stood in their gowns, their faces blurred, as though the camera had never focused properly. And beyond them, in the far corner, the figure waited. It raised its hand slowly, deliberately, and beckoned her closer. Laura woke, gasping, the sheets tangled around her body. She told herself it was nothing more than suggestion, the power of rumor seeping into her subconscious. Yet the dream returned the next night, and the next. Each time, the figure came closer. Each time, the eyes grew clearer. Her research notes took on the same obsessive tone that had once consumed Robert Miller. She began sketching the figure, circling its outline in photocopies of the photograph, writing long passages about its gaze, its posture, its meaning. She interviewed townsfolk who spoke in hushed voices of relatives who had seen the corner. One old man told her his brother had vanished after claiming the figure had followed him home. He kept saying it wasn't stuck in the picture, the man whispered, that it was waiting, watching. For who, I don't know. By the end of that summer, Laura's friends had grown concerned. She isolated herself, rarely leaving her rented room, her walls papered with blown-up copies of the photograph. When they confronted her, she insisted she was close to understanding it, that the figure was not a ghost, but something older, something that had always been there. And then, one night, she too vanished. Her landlord found the door locked from the inside. The bed was unmade, the window closed. The only sign she had been there at all was the photograph, lying face up on the desk. The students were unchanged. The building loomed, as it always had, but in the far corner, the figure's face was clearer than ever before, and its faint smile was unmistakable. From then on, the photograph was locked away more securely. The historical society refused all requests to view it. The legend, however, only grew. Some claimed copies of the image circulated secretly, passed hand to hand like a curse. Others swore that even reproductions carried the same power, that the figure's gaze could pierce paper, ink, and screen alike. In recent years, the story has taken on a digital form. The photograph has appeared online, uploaded anonymously to forums and obscure websites. Users report strange occurrences after viewing it: shadows flickering in their rooms, cold drafts where no window is open, the sense of being observed long after they shut their computer. A few have disappeared, their accounts abandoned mid-conversation, their profiles never active again. The original print still exists, locked in a vault somewhere in Harrowfield. No one knows for certain who holds the key, or if it is ever brought out into the light. But those who have studied the legend agree on one point: the figure is not bound by paper or photograph. It has always been there, waiting in the corners of our vision, caught only once by the camera's lens in 1920. And if you stare too long at the picture, if you let your eyes linger on the far corner, you may feel it too. That slow, deliberate gaze pressing against your own. That sense of presence just beyond the frame, waiting for you to look away.